What's your business? Don't think when I'm riding by. Ain't no drizzle, be the truth off the east side. I know we ain't got my money because they cut it high. I grind for your minds. I got the green.
Well. Welcome to class. Which one of y'all children is gonna bring the professor his wah-wah? Welcome to the Dream Show. I am not an unhinged lunatic. I am a guy who will, of course, be teaching some of you my opinions on history, on geopolitics, and a little bit of philosophy and religion as of today. I'm going to give a brief background of some of the things that we covered last time, and then we're going to get into the basics of today's topics. What exactly will be covered, and where this war comes from, why I'm covering it, etc., etc. So without further ado, let's get into that. So this is yesterday or the other day's notes. First, I'm going to take a look at the chat. We have Robert. Says, maybe an underhanded review of the war period, ? Thank you, Robert. Robert also says, all my children. Okay. It's a TV show we're not going to be covering today, but thank you. This is a notepad. So last time in G101, hosted by Professor Jad Ibn Fadia, topics covered were on that day. Are modern neo-pagans correct? History of Catholicism versus Judaism. European ancestral groups, Edom, Amalek, Ammon. In the Edom, Amalek, Ammon part, I compared really the obsession with certain Semitic groups in the Levant to the Germanic tribes. And if the Old Testament had taken place in Germany, and let's say that the chosen race were the Saxons, they would be saying that the Franks are, this evil race and needs to be blotted out, and that would have happened 3,000 years ago, and everybody would have moved on. So when modern rabbinics as well as modern neo-pagans say Amalek is Europe, Edom is Europe, that's an over-allegorization, which is not kosher, to use the appropriate term, with the actual scholarship of the Bible. Then we talk about comparison of Hinduism, and I don't know why Lord of the Rings popped into that. So let's go over today's topics. So today we're going to be covering Russia versus Ukraine war as of right now. What is happening in the war? Will the war continue? Sub-meeting, or side note for that, will be the meeting with Trump in Alaska. Then the status of the war in European and American perspectives. Okay. And Asian. Status of religion in Ukraine compared to Russia. Side note, Orthodox converts online, idolization of Russia, Putin, etc. Why the war happened. And then finally, post-Soviet Russia and Putin's overall endgame, copyrighted by Marvel. So I'm going to look at some of the chat, and then we're going to get into the episode today. Let's see what we got. Chris Mayhew says, dang, Jim, why you always start your stream so late, lol? Because I'm busy during the day, Buster. Solid Snake says, W. Jim, are you doing well? No. Christian Arbiter says, I just finished the last live stream. Well, I only stream when you're done with the episodes, Christian Arbiter, so that's a good thing. Nubras with Pope Emeritus J. Dyer, as his profile picture says, good evening. Good evening. CC88K says, hi, Jimmy. Okay. As always, super chats are not required on this show. They are, of course, appreciated. If you do not want to do a super chat, you could always just do a hang on, I'm getting a map pulled up. If you don't want to do super chat, you could always just sign up as a member, and that's kind of like a low tier subscription type thing. Or you could do none, but like I said, would be appreciated, not a requirement. I'm going to produce this material anyway, but it would be cool to have a little support as well. Other than that, I hope you guys are doing quite decent. My mic may go in and out simply because it requires me to hold it up, and so if I'm typing something at the same time, I may not end up doing that. So I'm just getting some of these settings ready on this map. Here we go. Chris Matthew says, isn't Putin's overall endgame to implement Duginism? It's not like Dugin is the Rasputin of post-Soviet Russia. So as if Dugin is like this warlock just sorceling, like an ensorcelled Putin has to do whatever Dugin says. No, perhaps. I would say you are actually partially correct, Chris Matthew. I'm just kind of messing with you. But yeah, you are partially correct. We will get into that. In fact, I'm going to add that to the note. Yeah. Okay, so see, you made it into the screen. Death to compromise. Ortho Donut says it's late. You mean late as in it's late at night, or the time is late to be reviewing Mr. Putin? Robert says buy the books. Oh yeah, you could just do that. You don't have to give me a super. You could just buy my material and actually read. Oscar Hernandez says, hello everyone. Well, hello to you. Solid Snake, I got your back, brother. Orthodox Cross, Russia, Greece, 199 Super Chat. Thank you very much. I'm wondering about the map dominant content. Does that come from a geography perspective? Well, that is what maps are, Mr. Robert. But no, it's just easier for me to display what I'm talking about when I have a map. So this is the map right now. We're just going to use this one. So as you can see, this is Ukraine. This is Russia. And then we're going to do this as well. Uh-oh. I want to do this. Uh-oh. Okay. These may not be the best colors, to be honest with you. Let's go with that. No, that's not much better. You know what? I think now we're a bit better. Okay, Russia is now the purple. So as you guys can see, we have a variety of colors here. Yeah, let's do that. Yeah, that's good enough. So Ukraine is blue, Russia is purple, Belarus is dark green, and then other former Soviet territories are going to be in the light green. So this map does not include all of Eurasia. So we just have parts of Kazakhstan and the Baltic states. I'm not going to include the Iron Curtain. We're just talking about what's in the proper Soviet Union. So this is Russia right now. Obviously, the war began. In 2014, Russia seized Crimea, even though most people did not recognize it in terms of actual, reality on Earth. It was seized. Then, as the war has gone on, these have been the primary points of contention. Okay, these areas. So this corridor in the east of Ukraine, which I'm labeling purple. Actually, I'll do this. Yeah, that's good enough. So these areas here have been the areas of contention. I included Kursk in Russia because Ukraine did, in fact, attack inside of the Russian borders. So this mixed blue and purple area is going to be where Ukraine and Russia have been fighting. The vast majority of deaths in Ukraine have been in this area. There have also been some deaths here as well. So there has been war throughout much of Ukraine, but the vast majority has been in this column right here. So this column here, including Crimea, has been the main areas that Putin wants to annex. For those of you who aren't aware of the demography in Ukraine, Ukraine is a majority Orthodox Christian country. It has a pretty sizable Greek Catholic population. So they're from the Byzantine Rite of Eastern Catholicism, and they're primarily here and called Transcarpathia, Ukraine, Lviv, okay, and Ivano-Frankivsk. Apologies for any mispronunciation. These areas have either a very large plurality or a majority Eastern Catholicism, as do the western parts of Belarus, as do parts of Hungary, Slovakia, etc. But and Albania, funnily enough. But anyway, these are where you have Eastern Catholicism. So this is the Catholic world here, going from Portugal through most of France, through Italy, the southern part of Germany, into the beginnings of Eastern Central Europe right here. This is the Catholic Europe. Okay. Then starting here, we have the borderlands between Catholic Europe and Orthodox Europe. And in the borderlands, we have Eastern Catholics in some of the areas. And we also have some Orthodox in Catholic countries. So when you start to see Orthodox in Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, and they start to see Eastern Catholics in Belarus, Ukraine, you know you're in the borderlands between these two religions. So I did want to give you guys some of these. Our friend Ahmed from Indonesia says, in terms of intellectual figure, I think Putin quoted Ivan Ilyin more than Dugin. Yeah, I don't think he quote maps Dugin all the time. Anyway, so the light green, let me just label them for any newcomers here. All right. So now everyone can see what's going on there. This has been where the war has been taking place. We could include Crimea, but that was in 2014. So when this war happened, kind of right on the cusp of when COVID had struck, it's actually been a while since this war started. So, I mean, COVID struck first, but still. Nobody, I was having this discussion with my dad a while ago, and nobody could have predicted that there would actually be a land invasion of the European continent in the 2020s, or anytime after like 2000, anytime after the 1990s, to be quite frank with you. So in this area here, this area of Ukraine actually has a lot of ethnic Russians in it. You may say, well, what's the difference between Ukraine and Russia? They're both Eastern Slavs. They probably have similar ancestry. It's really a difference of countries being named something else, right? That's actually not true. That's as if saying, if you're going to compare it to people of my ethnic background, everybody who speaks Arabic is the exact same ethnicity. You know, there's no difference between Syria and Lebanon, so why are they different countries? Now, someone would just say it's the religious aspect. I would disagree. I think there's a cultural difference between Lebanon and most of Syria. You know, the Syrian coast and Damascus aren't that different from Lebanon, but once you start going north and east, yeah, you're entering a totally different world than what is considered North Levant. I would consider that half of Syria to not be Levant. And likewise, Ukrainians are not the exact same ethnicity as Russia. Now, historically, what's the actual truth of that? I couldn't give you a straight answer at the moment because I have not mastered the subject. However, Ukrainians and Russians do not consider themselves to be the exact same ethnicity. Their dialect or version of their language, which is really just called a different language by pretty much everybody, is different. So they don't speak the exact same language, even though they're quite similar. And they have a different sense of national and cultural pride. Now, all of these areas outside of the Purple Russia were part of the former Soviet Union. So the Baltic states left, Belarus left, Ukraine left, Kazakhstan and the rest of the stans in Central Asia left, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan left. All of these areas used to be in one federation called the Soviet Union. Okay. So Putin, even though he has revived the Orthodox Church in some ways, and Orthodoxy is not some, underground destroyed religion anymore, Russia is still not, it didn't just 180 back to going to the days of the Tsar. We're still dealing with a Russia very, very, very heavily shaped by Soviet policy and Soviet geopolitics. So Russia, as Putin said, there are tens of millions of ethnic Russians who, when the borders were created, really, not created, but when those states of the Soviet Union seceded and were not part of Russia anymore, tens of millions of ethnic Russians were caught outside of their boundaries. And if you see, actually, there are ethnic Russians all in the eastern Baltic states. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, there are ethnic Russians who live here. So the reason there's an Orthodox population in these countries is because there are actual Russians living there, not just locals who became Orthodox. Likewise, the difference between Belarusians and Russians is probably even smaller than the difference between Ukraine and Russians. So again, very similar people, similar religion, at least originally, even if Belarus is not a very religious country. And then there's also quite a few million ethnic Russians in the northern part of Kazakhstan as well, in Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. So in all those countries, there are ethnic Russians. And yeah, Russia, the country, is not all ethnic Russians. Up here, you have like a Finno-Ugric type people. In Tatarstan and Bakoristan, you have a Turkic peoples. You have Kartvelian type peoples in the Caucasus, Dagestanis, Chechens. You literally have Buddhists from Central Asia here and Muslims from Central Asia here. So Russia is a multi-ethnic state. But at the same time, if there are ethnic Russians, Putin wants them to live in Russia. Let's look at a couple of the comments. Thoughts on Pine Creek Doug? I haven't seen much response to this stuff. Seems like a measured response to Tag. I disagree with his conclusions. No idea who that is. I'll have to look him up. But thank you, Thumbtag. That'll give me something to do in the next stream. Don Quintus says, hey, GM stream. Hello. Chris says, another cool topic would be review of the tech right. Okay, I will take a look at that one. I don't know who Nick and Yarvin are. We'll have to look at that. Omar says, many of these Ortho bros online see Russia and other Eastern Orthodox countries as Christian bastions, even though the Christian Orthodox nation was controlled by communist governments. True as that is, Mr. Assad, before communism had inflicted these countries, they were not. So most of these people who are Ortho bros online don't necessarily want Soviet Orthodoxy. They would like Orthodoxy before that. However, there is, I will admit, a confusion amongst many people who do delusionally, naively think that Putin has just twisted Russia into a 180 and it's a czardom now. It's not a czardom. He's still an ex-Soviet politician, and he's accepting of Orthodoxy, but he's still shaped by Soviet politics. So Russia is not a perfect place. The Soviet Union did a massive amount of societal damage to them, and especially the recession in the 1990s completely destroyed them. So they have had a lot of catching up to do. My bad. You are correct. Okay. That was difficult. Yeah, you are correct about that. What will it take for the war to end? Well, we're about to discuss that right now. All right, let's skip ahead. Eastern Orthodox nations were hit hard by many left-wing governments, and many Eastern Orthodox countries today are still recovering. Eastern Europe has one of the highest abortion rates in the world. Yes, that is true. And I talk about that quite a lot on my channel, Omar, so that's not like some hidden gnosis. I'm very well aware of that. Now, I went to Russia. You know what? Here. Jim went to the city of Moscow and the greater Moscow metro, and he also went to St. Petersburg and the greater Leningrad Polit, or whatever it's called, metro. So I've been to both those areas. I can attest that the average person on the street was not a hardcore Orthodox Christian. However, there was a great appreciation for Orthodox architecture, a great appreciation for what I see as Orthodox culture, a general identification with Orthodoxy. And then when I went into the Moscow metro, there were monasteries there, and the people there were, I mean, as you would expect, people go to a monastery are going to be religious, but I saw an extreme piety there. So I will say, even though the average person in Russia is not super religious, there are pockets of religiosity in Russia. It is not just an atheism factory, but for the people who say that, Russia's this bastion, I want to go back to the map. Russia's this czar bastion, that's wrong. So the war right now is in this state. Now, after the meeting in Alaska, Putin decided, all right, if you give us these into Russian control, then I'll stop the war and get out of Kursk. And that's it. He doesn't want Kiev, or Kyiv, as the Ukrainians say. He doesn't want all of Ukraine. Certainly does not want these areas. And I think he's giving up on a lot of the rest of eastern Ukraine as well. Now, originally, Mr. Volodymyr Zelensky has repeatedly said no to that. Oops. Okay. So if you guys don't know about Zelensky, let's get him up for a second. Volodymyr Zelensky almost never is seen wearing a suit, but jokes aside, he was always against it, and he said, Ukrainian parliament does not allow me the ability to secede any states to Russia or to give away any territory, so I can never even negotiate that. However, after the meeting in Alaska, all right, Zelensky seems to have changed his tune a little bit. So again, for those of you who are unaware, uh, Trump and Putin met in the state of Alaska, and that's quite historic and quite significant because Alaska, and we'll get back to Zelensky in a moment, was formerly part of Russia. So Russia kind of founded European, aka non-Native American Alaska. Later, it was sold to the United States. So America never declared jihad on Russia. It was not a battle of blood. They sold it. They made a pretty penny for it. Russia was large enough. They didn't really need or want the territory anymore. There were communities of Native Americans in Alaska who were, in fact, converted to Orthodox Christianity, which is a great source of pride because, for the most part, they did not receive the treatment that natives in North America did via the Puritans, nor did they receive the treatment that Mesoamericans and South Americans did. Though, again, my personal opinion is there was some pretty sinister stuff happening in the Aztec Empire, and it is not at all a bad thing that that empire is gone. And most Mexicans today are descended from people who joined Cortez to overthrow the Aztecs, so that's really not a contentious problem. The problem is people right after the conquistadors and their descendants were quite harsh on Mesoamericans, South Americans in general. We'll get to that another time. The point is, those people exempted. The Russians did not G-side the people of Alaska. So, in addition to that, there is also kind of a Soviet history in Alaska. Not that it was owned by Russia or anything, but there had just always been a Russian-American community living there. Even though they're very well integrated, they are a historic community. So Putin visited. It's obviously the one place where America and Russia should meet if they're going to be meeting in the United States. During this great meeting, they discussed many things. Trump vowed once again to end the Ukraine-Russia war. That brings us back to Mr. Zelensky. So Zelensky, after repeatedly stating that he does not possess the power to give away any states of Ukraine, he actually changed his tune. And he said, in a subtle fashion, that he would be willing to take a look at Putin's compromise and that he would make some concessions if the Russians made concessions. So it's not outright saying, take the eastern territories. But it's clear that Zelensky wants the war to be over. If the war continues, Ukraine's population will be, in the next couple of decades, 70% lower than what it is right now, or rather 70% lower than what it was a couple years ago. So it's a combination of an enormous amount of exodus, huge amount of death and destruction, and abysmal birth rate. So already the most eastern part of Eastern Europe, meaning Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, had a very low birth rate problem, especially amongst ethnic Russians, ethnic Slavs in general. In the Far East had a very low birth rate, high alcohol, drug, and abortion rate, and a lack of religiosity, especially from the end of the Soviet Union through to the 90s economic depression, basically an economic apocalypse, until relatively recently. Even now, the birth rates are not great, but compared to what's happening in the rest of Europe, they're pretty much on the same course. But Ukraine in particular has a very low birth rate, a massive emigration rate, a great death toll rate. So if Ukraine does not sue for peace, even if they can stop Russia from taking the capital, they probably can. But if the war goes on forever, there won't be a Ukraine left. You're going to have a country of that size have a population of a couple million people. I mean, it'll be as sparse as Mongolia. So they don't want that to occur. And honestly, even though people say that NATO wants Ukraine to be a buffer state between them and Russia, I don't think they want a totally collapsed, corrupt country any more than it was already corrupt before the war. To be quite frank, both Russia and Ukraine were quite corrupt and still are. Anyway, he was willing to change his tune, and Putin was willing to change his tune. Putin said he will take the Eastern Corridor plus Crimea, which he's not giving back. Previously, Zelensky said we want all territories, including Crimea, to come back into the fold. Now, I actually see some similarity between Zelensky and Mr. Jolani. Let's get Jolani on screen. I'm going to invite him. First of all, they dress the same way. Where is he? Where's this guy? Let's get Jolani on here. He doesn't go by Jolani. He's Ahmed al-Shara now. But anyway, this is the new leader of Syria. Even though they dress quite similar and kind of have a slightly similar appearance, I also find them to be a similar type of politician. So he kind of swept in, took control of Syria to fill the vacuum of Bashar, and he wants all of Syria to belong to Syria. Even though a lot of his cabinet and maybe even himself are of the supremacist of a Sunni persuasion, they want all of Syria. They're not going to settle for less. And Ukraine is the same until recently. So Zelensky has popped around and he said, no, we're not giving anything to Russia. But recently he changed his tune. So, like I've been saying, he changed his tune. And that's pretty major because, number one, you need Russia to be a bit flexible. And number two, you need Ukraine especially to be a bit flexible. So Ukraine can't just do whatever Western Europe tells it to. Otherwise, Western Europe could just tell them, keep fighting forever. We want to drain the hell out of Russia, and we don't care what it costs you. So for Zelensky, the wisest thing to do would be not to obey Trump, not to obey EU, but to do would be in the best interest for Ukraine. Now, let's get to the elephant in the room, which everybody's going to mention, which is the Jewish population of Ukraine. So, yeah, there are Jews in Ukraine. That's not a surprise. It has a historic community there, but guess what, guys? I hate to bring you this shock. So has Russia and Poland did, but not anymore, and we all know the reason for that. But per Russia and Ukraine, yeah, there was always a large and very serious Orthodox Jewish population there. So just pointing something out, guys, Orthodox Jews are not really the same as your secular Western European, very liberal Jewish person. Just so you're aware. And that's the end of that topic for this stream. So, what is my prediction? Will the war actually be over? I'm not going to say the war will actually be over, as in a guarantee, because I don't know what's going to happen. I would guess that we're starting to see the simmering down. There may still be some big battles up ahead. Right now, Ukraine is succeeding in the most recent battles, and Russia seems to be draining quite heavily. Russia, as well as Ukraine, has a massive population problem. This is, by the way, only 1/3 of the size of Russia at best, but the rest of it's kind of half-empty Siberian land. So this is the useful part of Russia, we'll say, in terms of demography. And even this area is underpopulated. In this entire country, we have 140 million people, and there's still quite some decently, arable land here in the southern belt. It's not all just Siberia out there. So it's even larger than this, and there's 140 million people. Compare that to Germany, population, a country of this size, which has 80 million people, and Italy, 60 plus million people, and the UK, 60 plus million people, and France, I think 50 million, 40 to 50 million people in France. So you have these countries in Western Europe have always historically been high in population density compared to the Middle East and Eastern Europe. So I don't think Russia is ever going to have 400 million. But 140 million and a stagnating population and a wartime population, low birth rate, and still, even though their abortion has been fixed, it's not as bad as it used to be, it's still quite bad. So things are not looking great for either side right now. I predict, and what I think is the most reasonable, is that Ukraine cedes at least Donetsk and Luhansk and Zaporizhzhia to Russia, simply because I think that'll stop the bloodshed. And I think Russia is entrenched enough there that it's no longer Ukraine defending land. This is now Russian-held land that Ukraine would have to reclaim. And a reclamation in a war is an extremely hard thing to do. It's one thing to defend a land for 5 years and then say, should we keep defending it? This is not so easy. That's a better position to be in than to have had the land, lost it after all of that bloodshed, and then go back for more and try to reclaim it. I don't think it's going to happen. In addition to that, again, many of the people in Crimea, in Zaporizhzhia, in Donetsk, in Luhansk, in Kharkiv, are ethnic Russians. And I'm not saying all of them want to, but some of them would like to be part of the Russian Federation. So that is a very basic rundown of what's happening in Ukraine and what you need to know in terms of geopolitical knowledge. All right, let's take a look at some of these comments. The map looks like petted. Okay, I don't know what's pointing that for. Let's go down. There are families behind Putin, I forgot, but I remember coming across this information. I'll get on the Duginism in a second. Eastern Europe has the highest amounts of atheists in Europe due to communism and the highest abortion rate in Europe as well. Actually, Omar, I'm glad that you brought that up because there is an elephant in the room, and that is the fact that Northern and Western Europe report high levels of Catholicism and Protestantism, but that's only by birth. So many people in Norway and Sweden and Finland are born into the Lutheran Church, but they don't ever participate in it after the age of 10. So I would estimate that Sweden and Finland especially are sub 50% theist. And if we don't include Muslim migrants, definitely, these countries are like 40% believe in God. And when I say believe in God, I don't mean an abstract belief. I mean, they have some kind of coherent understanding of Christianity. And that's maybe that's an optimistic guess. Norway would be slightly higher. It's a little more conservative than Sweden. Denmark is not is not super conservative, but Eastern Denmark and that Scan portion of Sweden right here, these are more conservative areas. Uh, just as well, Germany reports that everybody here is a Lutheran and everybody here is a Catholic, and everybody here in Belgium is a Catholic, but that doesn't actually mean that they actually are. France, for instance, is probably more honest about it because they are officially a secular republic, so they have no reason to pretend that everybody's Catholic. France is probably sub 50% actual Catholics, people who actually care even a little bit about the religion and even just participate in monthly feasts and stuff and like doing the galette du roi during the Epiphany. Yeah, I don't think, the majority of France actually puts any religious meaning into that stuff. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's a revival. There's said to be a revival in France. I know that Britannia and Normandy do have a higher level of religiosity than obviously the metropolitan of Paris. So that remains to be seen. Ireland, the youth are really not that Catholic. The UK is majority not religious, but atheism is going down a little bit. And Spain is, quote, Catholic, but a lot of them are super far leftist. And so in reality, are they actually Catholics who care about Catholic values? Probably not. So I don't disagree with you that Eastern Europe has its problems, but to pretend that it's much worse in Western Europe, I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true. Okay. Yeah, guys, please hit the like button now. Onyx Rock says, chance of Russia or Ukraine massively Islamizing eventually. I don't think Ukraine will Islamize, and the reason for that is that I think pound for pound, if you're not including like Azov, Orc, militant groups, pound for pound, the average Ukrainian is a little bit more religious than the average Russian. Neither of them are very religious countries, mind you. But the average non-involved in this war, just an average Ukrainian family, is a little more religious than the average Russian. And the majority of Ukrainians are Orthodox Christian. Now, many of them are leaving the country. Now, again, that does not mean that I approve of everything Zelensky's done. And that doesn't mean that every Ukrainian who's against Putin is pro-Zelensky. They might hate Zelensky and think he's a horrible leader. And they might also hate Putin and think he's an ex-Soviet shill and they don't want him either. So you guys do realize that in these situations and wars, people sometimes have a third option, even if it's untenable politically, where they don't like either side. And I would say that if you're removed from this topic, especially, you should refrain from being diehard on any side. Orthodox Christians should pray for this war to end. Even if you think, oh, Zelensky's a servant of NATO and he's prolonging the war and he should just acquiesce to Putin. Even if you think that, you should pray that the war ends and that both sides end, because these are the two largest Eastern Orthodox countries in the world, and they're just drilling through their population. So you could argue the war is a great way to reduce the Orthodox population. All right, let's go back to Zelensky. Varun says, I often hear that giving up territory to Russia would set a precedent for future conquests in places like Georgia. Do you think that Russia may possibly try to do this or has the capability? After this war, I don't think so. Russia obviously has a much larger population than any single European country, but it has a low birth rate, like I said, and its population is not growing, even with some legal migration from Central Asia. Keep in mind, Central Asian countries themselves don't have a massive population. Anyway, I don't think it's going to be invading anywhere. In fact, I would say Russia should fear China, because China, unlike the European Union, is not this, dove of peace that wants everybody to sing Kumbaya and get along. I'm sure if China ever saw the opportunity and knew Russia was weak enough, they would try to seize part of Eastern Russia, southeastern Russia. That would not be a total surprise. As China becomes stronger, if their relationship with Russia continues to deteriorate, I could see China just pulling a fast one. So if I were Putin, I would be very worried about the eastern border just as much as the west. In fact, maybe more so. Is there anywhere on this earth that Christians are on the rise? Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of South America and Central America south of Mexico. So not Mexico, but the other Central American countries, Sub-Saharan Africa, Pacific Islands. I would say that, yeah, Christianity is on the rise in Russia, but not as dramatically as people think. It's not going to go from the Soviet Union to 1800 czar stuff in one day. Yeah, more people have become Orthodox than they had during the Soviet Union. That is a rise, technically. I also think that in places that have become increasingly liberal, like to the point, and by liberal I mean wacko liberal, not your normal classical Democrat liberal or something. So places like the UK that have gone full on authoritarian in some of that position, yeah, those places have become more religious just out of a reaction. But for the most part, Europe has a serious problem with overthinking and with an abundance of philosophy. And no, that's not being me being anti-intellectual. Intellectualism can be okay, um, but sometimes it crosses the boundary into mind diddling, or as we used to say in this channel, mental masturbation. And that's really the opposite of scientific empiricism. So sitting around in a dark room diddling with your brain, that's not empirical science. And I think that that can get in the way of progress. And so China's an example of empiricism without religion. Not a huge fan of China though. Western Europe is an example of very little empiricism and a whole lot of intellectualism without any substance, other than the sciences. Those are doing okay in Northern Europe. And America's kind of not doing great on either of those fronts. So we could use more of common sense, normal religious practices in the world without devolving into overly thinking things. And I think there should be a healthy relationship between empiricism and religion, quite frankly. All right. He says, "I'm from Denmark. Most people here, from my experience, are average Reddit atheist." Yeah, I think that's very obviously true. Another Solid Snake super chat. Guys, let's boost the likes. Thank you. Guys, please like the video. All right. All right. I've heard France has a high Catholic birth rate. Yeah, the Catholics in Western France have a high birth rate, but overall, most of France does not have a high birth rate. The reason France has a high birth rate compared to other European countries is how well they've done with migration. And you may be pro or against that, but they've put in a lot of effort in bringing people to France and then attempting to do their best job at assimilation. And to their credit, I will say France has done a better job at assimilation than Scandinavia and much of Germany, much better than Spain, much better than Italy, much better than Greece. So France has, for all of its faults, has done a better job at forceful assimilation than any of those other countries. And that doesn't mean forcing them to be Catholic. It just means they have to do secular égalité, liberté, fraternité, France. But they have succeeded in that to an extent. To an extent. Let's go back to the list. So we covered this. We covered that. We kind of covered this. In terms of Asian, I didn't just mean China. Now, China, I don't think is pro Russia necessarily. They've very cautiously not chosen a side because they don't know if Russia's going to win. And in East Asian culture, it would be embarrassing for them to lose face. In addition to that superficial commentary on their culture, it's also just the Communist Party's activity to be as opportunistic as humanly possible. They have no loyalty to the Russian Federation. If Russia collapses tomorrow, they won't shed a tear. We'll put it that way. As for the rest of Asia, India has actually taken a pro-Russia stance in the last few years, and they're allowed to because they like China aren't beholden to Europe or America. Like they're nowhere near as strong as America. China is probably on par with Western Europe, to be quite frank, but India is not quite on par with Western Europe altogether yet. But India has the weight to throw around where they can say, "Hey, you all suck. I'm going to be pro-Russia," and no one can really do anything about it except maybe increase a tariff. Nobody can actually threaten India or China. All right. We talked a little bit about this stuff. We're going to get into that in a second. Let me go to why the war happened first. The war began, at least on Putin's side, that NATO was increasing its boundary lines further and further into Europe than it had done before. So we are going to now leave the map that I was on, which somebody so callously insulted. So thank you very much for that. And I'm going to craft a new map for you guys. One that hopefully you all approve of. Okay. So here we go. This is Europe again. We can all see this, yeah? Yeah? Yeah, good. So, again, we had the Soviet Union, right? Here. And the Soviets had additional influence in much of Europe. Right? Everything here except for Greece, pretty much. You see? You guys see? See all that? Good. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had the West. I'm not going to color every single country in the West, but just the main ones who are actually involved in this. The West kind of, push people toward joining their cause. So we had this collapse here. NATO began to become a little more serious. And as it pushed further and further, Poland is a bastion, the Baltics, its activities in the Balkans as well, we then arrive at Ukraine. And as you can see, Ukraine is right on the border. So if NATO moves or is allowed, and basically NATO is kind of an outfit of American hegemony, even though it benefits Europe and Europe is part of it greatly, it has a strong American bias. So if America/NATO can put powerful weapons right here on Russia's border, and Moscow is only right there, that's a major problem. And so Russia invaded because on their pretext, this is a way to prevent America from getting too close to Russia, essentially. In addition to that, Russia is also trying to extend its influence into Europe. So it has influence in Hungary, has influence in Serbia, and in Serbia and Bosnia, and in other parts like Macedonia and Montenegro. It does have some influence. Previously had a lot in Armenia and Syria and Cyprus, but that's kind of been going down now. But so I think that this has been a dual project where you see multiple reasons for Russia's involvement. From the Ukrainian side, this is just a callous, nonsensical war that should not have happened, and they need to defend their land territorially from this country that used to be the dominator of the entire region. So there are obviously two perspectives here. Now, if we take a look at this, again, these maps are not that great. I do not endorse these maps to be used in a scholarly setting. I'm simply showing you guys them because I think that these are a quick illustration. This is a very rough map using multiple factors, including Pew Research, of general religiosity. So it does not take into account which religion. So for Lebanon, it's at, 1/3 Christian, 2/3 Muslim of various denominations country. That would be an average of all of them. So it's not just one religion in particular. As you can see, Turkey is more religious than Iran. That's actually true in real life. Iran is not as religious as Turkey. Kazakhstan is nowhere near as religious as the rest of Central Asia. Yeah, that's true as well. Romania being the most religious Orthodox Christian country, on par with Georgia. Yeah, that's true. Greece being slightly lower than that, but significantly more religious than Belarus and Russia. Yeah, that's all 100% true. So the thing is, Russia and Ukraine clearly have a pretty dismal overall religiosity figure. Now, again, these averages are not perfect. If we look at Bulgaria, for example, it looks like almost nobody's religious in Bulgaria. What really happened is that 60% of the country, or rather 48% of the country, straight up does not even belong to the Orthodox Church anymore. So almost half of the country is just not Orthodox at all. That's a subject we'll get into another time. The other 50-ish% of the country that is Orthodox is only moderately religious. So you have 50% are not Orthodox, 50% are, but they're not super religious. That's why it looks like that. Now, the Orthodox Bulgarians might be religious. Some of them might be religious on a case-by-case basis. It is not an atheist country by any means, but it has a large portion of atheists, so that brings the average way down. I think the same can be said for Belarus and Russia. You'll find people that are religious in Russia, but because there's a massive population that is straight up atheist that does not belong to Orthodoxy, it's going to bring the average down. Second of all, even amongst Orthodox Russian Christians who practice, the practice level and the importance of religion are not extremely high. So Russia has a lot of catching up to do. As you can see, Ukraine is marginally more religious than Russia, but not a massive amount, nowhere near the level of religiosity as Poland. And even Poland's not as religious as Romania. So based on this map, the most religious Orthodox places to go to would be Serbia and Bosnia, Montenegro, Macedonia, Greece, Romania, Moldova, Georgia. And everyone else is still playing catch up. So it's an important thing to take a look at that. And when I see a lot of these guys online who have converted to Orthodoxy over the years, and there's been a growth of interest in Orthodox Christianity on the internet. Okay, like if you just Google Ortho Bro, you have all this. That can generally be considered a positive. The fact that Orthodox Christianity is even in the heads of people who are on the internet, who speak English, who's before 15 years ago, had never heard of Orthodox Christianity outside of a couple references in The Simpsons. So this is a good thing that people know what Orthodoxy is. But some people have gone off the deep end, and some people are a little naive about politics and history, and they have a strange idea that Russia is a czardom, like I mentioned a few times, which, to be quite frank with you, it's not a czardom. So it has improved since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the economic recession of the 90s. It is by no means a utopia of orthodoxy and has quite a long way to go. Same with Ukraine. So for those pro NATO guys who are like Ukraine is a million times better than Russia, it's not a million times better. They're both in a dismal state, and this war is not helping. So there are many pockets of religious people in both countries, but the average person is not super religious. Second of all, I would consider that Western converts to Orthodoxy can have an admiration of cradle Orthodox countries, but should also have an Orthodox identity of the West as well. Because as time goes on, it's okay at the start to be, hey, we're minorities, we're going to idolize these Eastern countries. But as time goes on, and if the population grows in the United States and in other parts of Europe where, let's say the dominant religion is Catholicism, you can't always just say I'm ex-Orthodox, I converted, but I idolize Bulgaria, but I live in Spain. At some point, there has to be a Spanish and Orthodox symbiosis, or else it's not going to have a long-lasting effect. Matea says Moldova is more religious than Romania. I think, again, that has to come down to averages. Based on my own research, I haven't been to these two countries, but based on anecdotal evidence and my own deep research into the topics, there are quite a lot of people in Romania who are not Orthodox, and so that brings the average down a little bit. In addition, there are people who are not religious in Romania, but then there are people who are. So it's all a game of averages. It's not saying the average person is, let's say, 70% Orthodox. It's just saying that on average, 70% of Romanians are somewhat religious. But I would not contest you on Moldova. I know that Moldova has a large percentage of Orthodox, and Transnistria as well, even though that's part of the same country, also is quite Orthodox. So both of those countries are very Orthodox, and compared to Russia and Ukraine, they're doing significantly better. I'm going to open up the chat now. Let me get the link going. So sorry, guys, if this was not like the most exciting stream. I just kind of went over a few things, and my next stream will actually be a review of a debate with Jake the Muslimeen. So I might be reviewing either the Voice of Reason sex conduct scandal, or I will be reviewing the here you go, or I'll be reviewing the debate between Jake Brancantella and some professor. El Presidente says, if the Orthodox churches converted the Romani, could their birth rate offset declines in Eastern Europe? Not throughout all of Eastern Europe, but it would probably be a boon for Romania if people were more syncretized to the same religion, sure. Modi tends to be very non-confrontational. I would say India is trying its best to stay neutral and do what serves its best interests. Yeah, but Varun, I would agree with the second comment. In a way, you could say this is support for Russia. Yeah, being neutral is in itself a position. Because if Europe and America are saying you cannot be pro-Russia, you cannot even be neutral, and then India says, no, I want to be neutral, that is being more pro-Russia than what America would want. But because India has the power, the demography, the nuclear arsenal, the economic size, the geopolitical influence, they really don't have to listen to what anybody else has to say. Very unfortunate that thousands of Christians are losing their lives in the war. I agree. Why is it that Muslim-Christian relations are relatively good in Russia but not the West? Because Muslims have lived in the boundaries of Russia and extended borders of the Russian Empire, the Russian Soviet Union, and the modern Russian Federation for hundreds of years. So it's as if saying, why are relations between two groups in the United States of America so good, like Catholics and Protestants? Shouldn't they hate each other because of the wars of religion in Germany and France? No, because they've been together for so much time now, and they have a common American culture. I would say the same for Russia, though it does depend on the region. Dagestanis and Chechens are not pro-Russia. Like some of them will, acquiesce to Putin, and they are strangely eager for the Ukraine war, but they are not necessarily they're not necessarily as syncretized or acclimated to a pan-Russian culture as much as Turkic Muslims. So people of Turkic, Tatars, etc. ancestry in Russia. Those Muslims have been part of Russia for a long time without much conflict. So the Turks and the Turkic steppe peoples who were Muslims were invading Russia all the time up until the 1600s. Then Russia conquered them, and yeah, sometimes Russia used a very firm grip on them. But for the most part, there was never like some great revolt where they broke away and fought against Russia. Whereas recently you had the Chechen wars where Russia invaded into Chechnya. So those are some key differences right there. Also, a difference in culture between those. Um, yeah, so that would be one reason why you don't hear a lot of Christian versus Muslim stuff in Russia, because the main parts of Russia, there's that's where, like I said, the Turkic Muslims live, and they're very acclimated to a Eurasian Russian culture. Now, another thing I want to mention before we get too off topic is Duginism. So, who's Mr. Dugin? Okay. Alexander Dugin. Okay. Inside Putin's brain. The political philosophy of Alexander Dugin. Yeah, I don't think that Duginism is like this master, okay? This master of all of Russia. I think that's kind of a gross exaggeration. But there is definitely, you know, there is definitely some influence. And so what is Eurasianism? Well, Dugin's kind of a lefty, to be honest with you guys. So if you're huge fans of what he has to say, you're probably a little bit lefty. Now, don't take that as a grave insult. Left does not necessarily mean that you're anti-religious or whatever. You can be pro-religion and you can be pro-conservative and still be kind of lefty. But let's all be honest. Eurasianism is not some trad colonial European ideology. It's actually the opposite. It's as far away from trad European colonial ideology as you can possibly get. So Duginism is kind of a way to be against traditional right-wing Europeanism without being a whack job super liberal. And so Dugin envisioned this idea called Eurasianism, where he thinks Russia does not belong to Europe. Russia is not just a white European country. It is a multi-ethnic empire. And what makes Russia strong and unique is that it belongs to this Eurasian civilization. So it's a combination of Eastern Europe, a combination of Silk Road, okay, Central Asia, the Caucasus, even parts of the Middle East and down into Mongolia and Siberia. That's what Russia's all about. So his ideology is not, I'm a trad czar, colonial, I'm a trad Peter the Great colonial, I like Protestants in Northern Europe, I like conquering the whole world and forcing people to be European, or acclimate to European values. Yeah, that's not what Duginism is all about whatsoever. He's not as far left as some certain ideologies are, but this is not the trad right-wing ideology. And so there are quite a few ortho bros, Orthodox converts, and even Putin himself who are influenced by these kind of ideas. Again, the invite link is open, so if you guys want to come in, you can. Basically, that's what Duginism is. And it's very integral to understanding what Russia's all about. If you don't know what this man is about, I would recommend that you read about it. So if we go back to the list real quick, it seems we've covered pretty much everything. And Putin's overall endgame. I didn't cover that yet. Putin's overall endgame, I would say it is influenced by Duginism, but not to the extent that, he's just going to obey him like Rasputin and ensorceling Putin or something like that. It's kind of ridiculous. However, Putin's desire is not to have a European colonial project. He very obviously prefers to have pro-Russian, Eurasian, and Asian people in his country, fighting for his country, than to have people who are vaguely similar to European values. And if you watch any recent Russian documentaries, even those produced on part by the Orthodox Church of Moscow, you'll see a lean away from the West and kind of a demonization of the West. Not just the modern West, not just like, oh, we don't like, Bill Clinton capitalism. No, it's not just that. I've seen a few documentaries where they very, very strongly emphasize the departure that the West had. So, in their mind, like many other Orthodox thinkers, the West departed from the East. And so, Orthodoxy, like Islam even, is a way for Russia to not be part of the West. It is a Christian religion, yes, but it's much different than Catholicism, worlds away from Protestantism. So, yeah, even though there are guys who go too extreme and they make fun of it and they think that if you're Orthodox, it means you're anti West, you don't have to be anti West to be Orthodox. But if you're Russian, using Orthodoxy as a way to be anti West is something that Putin has done. And so that's why he said Orthodoxy is more like Islam. It's not like Catholicism. And he has said that. So, all right. Well, the lines are open if you guys want to call. Hello, Crook. How are you?
Doing good. Really busy tonight, and I can't be too loud or on here for too long since people around me are asleep already. But I just wanted to say that the stream and the topics here pretty much prove that, when you step outside of the Western frameworks, it's not really comfortable to classify things as left-wing, right-wing, centrist, moderate, because political spectrums and political beliefs across different spheres of the world do not really correspond to more Western-centric ideologies. That's why you will have both people on the left and the right praising Putin. You will have some people who think he's a pragmatist, a weird form of centrism, and all that. And this would even apply to those who are trying to look into political theories in the Middle East. Like, if you want to look at Baathism or say Nasserism, you will find that they mix a whole bunch of ideas. If you want to look at the Islamist parties, you will see that you have more traditional Islamists, which could be considered right wing, versus Islamists that hijack left wing revolutionary rhetoric. And I think this applies to Russia as well, because though I'd say Russia is more close to the West in this regard, which is why, they can have a typical far left, far right, and whatnot. The development of Putin's ideology doesn't really correspond comfortably to what we would see in Europe or the United States, Canada. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think you're correct. Russia is more similar to Europe than China is, but they're also their own civilization. And you're correct that the typical right left stuff isn't as prominent there. And like we said with Dugin, he's left, but he's not a liberal. Like, he's kind of conservative. He just doesn't like European colonialism. He wants some kind of Eurasian civilization instead.
Yeah, and the word Eurasian is actually pretty key for describing Russia. If we did go back in time to the early 1900s, yes, we can obviously see the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks are far left. We have the more traditionally right-wing czarists and all that. But also, with the way how Bolshevik ideology developed, a lot of it started incorporating elements of Russian nationalism. It started incorporating elements of Eurasianism, because even though Russia adopted a very Western ideal of communism, you guys got to remember, Marx thought the revolution was going to happen in Germany, America, Britain first, not Russia. He thought that was a backward civilization where communism would have to come later. Even still, the far left, supposedly modern cosmopolitan Bolsheviks were still taking on Eurasianist ideals. They got to secure Iran. They had this inclination to specifically want the Slavic lands to be communist as well, even though they would have been above such things. Gun to their head, all the Bolsheviks would have been like, yeah, we'd rather just have all the Slavs be communists and everyone else be capitalists if we could have it that way, or instead of the other way around. So this would also apply to China, in my opinion, as well. That's an entire other can of worms, and that's another video you could do a stream on, because China's ideology itself, despite the red banner of the CCP or whatever, still incorporates elements of, the Chinese Empire, the Chinese Republic, because China still has to take on the roles and responsibilities of its previous states. And a lot of the Chinese foreign policy is no longer about supporting communist revolution abroad. If you lived during the Cold War, the Chinese and the Soviets were also supplying these far left groups, but that appears to have been a fluke. And I can't recall the last time China was supplying, revolutionary armed leftist groups abroad. Now they'd be more than happy to work with monarchies, conservative states, capitalist states, all in the name of money, whilst pursuing their own Chinese foreign policy.
Yeah, I would say that's definitely a legacy of Deng Xiaoping.
Exactly.
But yeah, it's very interesting. communism, Marxism, you're right, took place in Central Europe, and they expected it to be something for Central Europe and Western Europe, and it really caught on because of industrialization, guys. So you're wondering, why did all these idiots become communists? Well, they had horrible working conditions. They were working in factories, which no one ever knew what a factory was before this, and yeah, they were making very little money for horrible abusive conditions. So yeah, there was definitely an appeal to Marxism. Now, most people didn't read the super intellectual stuff. They just said, "Hey, there's a guy who is telling us that us laborers need more rights. Let's just jump on board." And because of the prominence of factories, obviously Marx and others thought this is going to catch on here in the West, where we're industrialized, not in Russia, where you still have this agrarian agricultural civilization where most of the people don't even live in cities. They live in these like villages scattered throughout the Urals and the rest of Western Russia and into Siberia. So yeah, I do agree. It's interesting that it happened in Russia, and I would say that was probably a slam dunk for the Central Powers to just throw Lenin at Russia in the middle of World War One was pretty insane, and it had this unintended consequence of changing the world afterward. We'll have to get to that another time,
Yeah,
but you are
and
right.
and even then, when it emerged, say, well, I wouldn't say it emerged, but whenever communist regimes were imposed on Central Eastern Europe after World War II, a lot of the states there also began taking some of their pre-communist ideology on, or at least if it would benefit the Soviets. East Germany, for example, had to prove it was a legitimate Germany. Yugoslavia is a bit of an interesting case because I would argue that Tito kind of brought upon his own revolution. He wasn't installed by Stalin. In fact, they split, but communist Yugoslavia tried to also incorporate some elements of pan-Slavism, or at least pan-South Slavism. And again, China would also prove my point because China was considered to be one of the backward states. I believe if Marx was to be told where the first Asian communist state would be, he'd probably say Japan, because that would have been considered the only civilized, quote unquote, Asian civilization.
Yeah, definitely.
There,
It's
yeah,
shocking
that's
that
what
it
happened
was.
in China.
Well, it's shocking that it was both China and Russia. Um,
Exactly.
those are two countries that I don't think anybody would have predicted from the outset of those events to have happened. And there's a reason why Stalin had to be the leader. Trotsky was very idealistic, but as you know, Trotsky and his idealistic communist intellectuals were not even 1% of the country, and they couldn't relate to the common people. The common people were still not as enlightened as they were, as in they did not know about European Enlightenment philosophy. They didn't read that much about intellectual ideas. They didn't care about this spiritual communist awakening. And so you needed someone like Stalin to just kind of brute force the country and command it into industrialization. And so
Yeah.
that's really what kept communism going, was he
And what
made it industrial.
Right. And what's interesting about Stalin as well is that he was a Georgian, but by being the leader of the USSR, which is dominated by Russia, he ended up taking a lot of these pan-Slavic, and Georgians are not Slavs, as Young Gamer can attest to if he's in the comment section. Georgians are not Slavic, and Stalin had a bit of a weird position because even though he was a communist, he still wanted to pursue some degree of Georgian interests, but also wanted to put some degree of Georgian interests aside to appeal to the Russian majority.
Yeah.
So it just goes to show you how complex ideologies can be. Because
Right.
on one hand, Stalin pretty much let the Georgians and Armenians keep their own alphabet, and some of their nationalism wasn't seen as a threat to the dominating Russian class. But at the same time, he also engineered the Caucasus borders, his own people, mind you. He engineered the borders in a way where if they were to split, these countries would fight amongst themselves and presumably turn to Russia for help. So
Right.
nothing is ever clear-cut black and white.
Well, I think that circling back to the Russia-Ukraine war, with Stalin, it's interesting because without Stalin, I think the nostalgia for communism would have faded a lot faster.
Yeah.
Number one, Russia wouldn't have progressed technologically, industrially as it did. Number two, communism without Stalin would not have much of a Russian flavor. It would be this extremely left wing, extreme ideas from Trotsky. He wanted this global nonstop revolution. I think it very quickly would have been just kind of pushed aside. He was way too idealistic. And so by having Stalin be the guy, even in modern Russia, you have a lot of boomers and greatest generation who are nostalgic for the Soviet days, because they idolize a figure like Stalin, not somebody like Trotsky. Nobody walks around with giant portraits of Trotsky in Russia. That's only college students in America.
Yeah.
Real
And
Russians like Stalin.
exactly. And to be a little blunt, if Trotsky were to be doing what he would be doing, let's just say a lot of far right conspiracies would be very validated because of Trotsky's origins. Ironically, Stalin himself would have also believed in much of those conspiracies, as we saw
Right.
with things like the Doctor's Plot in the USSR.
And I do think that we have to. I think I'm the only guy who's confronting this Jewish thing head on without hiding it that much. I'm just straight up trying to get
Yeah.
to the bottom of this stuff. And by the way, for anybody who doesn't watch my streams and just tuned in, no, I don't subscribe to the vast majority of any of those conspiracy theories. Although I'm also not completely imbecilic, and I know the mind of ethno-religious minorities because I know how Christians in the Middle East work as well. And I think that's the best
Yeah.
way that you can explain it. I think it's comparable to that. And I would even say people like Trotsky wouldn't even get along. They'd probably be disgusted and ashamed by Orthodox Jews, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Like, it doesn't matter if Trotsky himself were to say, by the way, I think Judaism is the worst religion in the world. We're going to forcibly convert all the Jews to atheism or bust. A lot of people would just be so hung up on his origins as a Jewish person that if he were to leave the USSR, the far right would have a massive field day. Again,
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm just going to read this super chat. Snake, thank you again for the super chat. $9.99 USD. He says, I'm not sure if it's on topic, but what do you think the average Orthodox Christian in Russia and Ukraine see Patriarch Kirill, and does or has the war affect how they see him? I think Ukrainians have lost a lot of faith in him because they see him as kind of this henchman of Putin who is just declaring Orthodox jihad on Ukraine. Now, the truth of that is that he is neither the bastion of theology that certain people online say he is, nor is he this, jihad mufti declaring a fatwa against Ukraine, and nor is he the servant of Putin. There have been actually quite a few times when Kirill and Putin have completely disagreed on a topic, and Patriarch Kirill has straight up said he does not believe in Eurasianism and he thinks it's wrong. He thinks Russia has to have a Russian, Slavic, Orthodox culture as the predominant thing. And minorities, they live there, but they have to be part of that. It has to be a celebrated thing. It can't just be this like kind of Sovietized Russia where Orthodoxy is one of 10 religions. He doesn't want that. He wants Russia to be an Orthodox country with some Muslims and some whatevers included in it, but it's Orthodox. Whereas if you ask Putin, he will not tell you Russia is an Orthodox country. He'll tell you Russia is a country that is Orthodox and also has Muslims and this and that, and it's open to everybody.
Yeah, so like Russian to him would be more of the nationality. I mean, he probably believes in Russian ethnicity as well, but for him, that would be seen as very close to what the Ukrainians and Belarusians are, the East Slavs. So what you're saying is it's not as simple as people think it is. The world is more complex. Who would have known?
Yeah, and you know what? I don't want to make a cop out and just say like, "Hey, that's my answer to everything." Everything's always complex. Nothing is simple. Every time you have a question, you're wrong because you're too complex. That's not true. There are many times when sometimes the straight up answer is probably the correct one. But because it's the internet, there are people who grossly over exaggerate. I'm gonna let on Orthoholics.
Sure.
All right, Orthoholics. It is myself and two crooks. How's it going?
It's going good. It's going normal. How's it going for you?
It is going quite decent. So we've talked about a plethora of topics that I had on the notepad, and now we've merged kind of into communism and Putin and what Russia is today. What would you like to discuss on these topics?
In regards of like Ukraine,
Yeah,
and just like the whole I guess that era of like Sovietism, I've always found it. I had a really bad encounter with one dude because like he didn't understand like I think the purpose of Ukraine and like what it's meant to be, because I've always been told by like even the Slavs and even fellow Ukrainians that it was just supposed to be a buffer state for the longest time, and it really was never supposed to be its own country.
right. Well, seeing that, or be that as it may, that is one opinion, but at the same time, there are reports of people. I'm not sure if it was a saint, but there was something that I read a little while ago where they discussed the presence of these lesser Russians. So like you had Great Russians who are Russians, and then
Hmm.
Western or lesser Russians who are what we would call Ukrainians today. And they were described as having a subculture, as in they had a different, there was a notable cultural difference. Now, does that mean Ukraine always was destined to be its own country? Probably not. And when the Soviet Union fell, the West scrambled pretty quickly to want to have a country that was separating Russia from Europe a little bit more. Now, Ukrainians probably also wanted to be separate from Russia because even though the Holodomor was a long time ago compared to when the Soviet Union broke up, local Ukrainians probably thought, we have a lot of resources here and we don't just want to be dominated by people from Moscow. So even if we are ethnically the exact same, the power is always going to be to the northeast of us and they're just going to use our resources. So it would be better for us to have our own country. I'm sure that's how some Ukrainians felt, even if culturally they weren't massively different. Do you get what I'm saying there?
I do get what you're saying, but then was there an ethnic component to this kind of communism? Like, did they have like kind of a, I don't want to say an ethnic heritage, but like there was like an ethnic communist culture that Russia was trying to like spread with its communism?
Well, I would say that there was a pan-Russian flavor to communism which arose after Stalin. So, like during Stalin, after he rose to power, before him, they wanted to wipe out any sense of a pan-Russian identity. Stalin said, "This is way too lefty. We have to do some kind of this is going to be an empire, but it's just going to do communism."
Yeah.
So he did promote, as Two Crooks was saying, he did promote a Russian supremacy in one way, while also undermining it from becoming fascist or nationalist. So he didn't want Russians to get too ahead of themselves, but he wanted to be the dominant culture. So even
Yeah.
if you were Ukrainian, had the same religion as a Russian, and you were both communists, you would still feel that there was a level of difference.
Right. And if I just had to add one more thing I forgot to mention, although it's really important, I think a lot of these identity politics sort of arose amid World War II because the Soviets found that the average Russian was more likely to fight for motherland, fatherland, Great Russia, etc., than more abstract ideals of communism during wartime. So that's where a lot of this sentiment during the Stalin period arose from. But at the same time, Stalin also was not really part of this, bourgeois adjacent intellectual elite. He knew how people felt about their own customs and culture. So I felt it would have come about anyway, where Stalin would have to play up the whole, oh, great Russia kind of thing, while also maybe placating some minority interests if they didn't get in the way. But World War II really pushed that out of necessity.
Okay.
This is a quick map, guys. I did not produce this one, believe it or not. This map just shows the difference. The earlier ones I did. But these here, you can see these different cross icons. So the orange, the green, and the yellow are Orthodox, belonging to different patriarchates, whether it's Kiev or Moscow. And then the blue are the Greek Catholics. So these areas are majority Greek Catholic, these like 4 zones of Ukraine. So people often forget that. But because of that, and I also want to say one other thing, even within Ukraine, there's a cultural difference. So Kiev and west of that are a lot more Western than the eastern part. The eastern part is culturally a little more Russian and less removed from the West. So there is actually a cultural, even within Ukraine itself, there are differences. Someone from all the way here in the West would be different culturally than someone from Luhansk. Not in terms of like they're a different race or anything, but it's how they view themselves. Someone would be a little more sympathetic to Soviet nostalgia in the far east, which just so happens to be where Putin has claimed most of the Ukrainian territory.
If I have to make a minor rant to this map, I'm so used to Catholics being colored in yellow.
I know, man. It's bugging me right now.
Right.
Give Catholics their gold back.
I know. On a totally unrelated topic, I just want to bring this up because I have to go in a few moments, but a friend, Imperator, says, have you heard of the Hebrew Catholics? Ivrim Katolim, I think. Catholicism has been used as a term before Orthodoxy was. Hebrew Nazarene Catholic. Okay. Well, basically, that is the idea that, there are people of Jewish ethnic origin who become Catholic. I don't know if he's talking about a different group, but I know that the Catholic Church of today is reaching out to this group called the Hebrew Catholics, who are, again, Catholics, but they have emphasized more the culturally Jewish parts, and it's for ethnic Jews to become Catholic. So it's not like supposed to be a different religion. But anyway, yeah, great questions, Orthoholics. I mean, it's a complex subject. I'm not a master
Right.
of this topic, but I'm trying to explain it as best as I can for the audience because I see a lot of very pro-Ukrainian people online and very, very pro-Russian people, and
Right.
I want to get to the bottom of it.
I do have one question, which is a little off topic, but I think it's
Sure.
it's
Yeah, go ahead.
How much of communist style regimes and I guess even politics and maybe even philosophy do you think has inspired a lot of Middle Eastern government and way of handling its own citizens?
Yeah, great question. So I will say one thing. Officially, communism is despised as an ideology in the Middle East. However, there's a distinction between the ideology of communism and then the way communists rule their country. So I'm glad that you brought up specifically communist rulers. So someone like Stalin would be a blueprint for certain Middle Eastern dictators, even though they wouldn't want state atheism and actual communism. Um, People like Bashar, Saddam, they ruled the way, if Stalin had been born in Syria or Iraq, he would have ruled the way that they had ruled. Or maybe he would have been tremendously more forceful on industrializing those countries. But yeah, someone like Saddam, he was not a state atheist, so he wasn't as extreme on the ideology. But he inherited a system, the Ba'ath Party. He cracked down on people who were against him, whether they were Muslims or whether they were not. And he ruled with an iron fist. So that kind of authoritarianism of Stalin and other, let's say, Balkan communist leaders, that is definitely idolized in the secular dictatorships of the Middle East. Now, the more fundamentalist or theocratic Islamic rulers would want nothing to do with that whatsoever. So a country like Saudi Arabia, I don't, even though people like to complain about them imprisoning certain people, I don't think they take much influence from Stalin. But Bashar al-Assad, Saddam Hussein, they definitely did.
Yeah, and this also goes back to my point about how ideologies get more complex in or irrelevant in different parts of the world. A lot of the Ba'athist ideology arose from taking elements of the USSR that they liked, but they couldn't fully accept communism, Marxism, its class conflict ideology, because there's always either some degree of Arabism, local nationalism that they wanted to prop up that wasn't found in Marxism. And also, you have to bear in mind, a lot of these Ba'athist groups, they are sometimes distinct or often distinct from the local Communist Party. Now, you do have communists like, say, a lot of the Palestinian groups that were rising up after World War II. But the thing is, how much of these communist groups in the Middle East would stay in power after they got what they wanted? It's like how many Armenians supported socialist revolutionary groups, even though Armenia doesn't have a socialist revolutionary government. So also, that's why whenever you had these pan-Arab or Arab nationalist leaders take power, like Nasser, Assad, Saddam, they would probably form an alliance with the communists when possible, especially if they had similar revolutionary goals. But they would also see communism as not our thing, not our ideology, especially if they wanted to be more pragmatic about economics and keep
There's
some
also
degree of the
why I
market.
think there's also why Two Crooks is 100% right, but I also think this is why a lot of them failed because they weren't far left wing, and by left wing I don't mean liberal, but they weren't far left like communism, and they weren't far right like Islamic theocracy. So I don't really know what their end game was because yeah, in some ways maybe their idea could have been an idealistic vision for the Middle East, but maybe time and atmosphere and the events that occurred during that time just wouldn't allow for it. But they kind of lost ground everywhere. Like Nasser made fun of people who were Islamic fundamentalists, but if he spoke that way in Egypt today, someone would probably want to stone him or throw him in prison. So these people get idolized, and the Middle East is more conservative now than it was in the 50s all the way until the late 80s or early 80s. So there had been a lot of change. And these guys, they were just in this middle where they tried to be modern industrial leaders. And in some ways they were successful, but ideologically, none of them could agree on what the value really was. Like, what was it they were really seeking for? Nasser had this great vision, but I don't know, his execution was pretty horrible. So, and then if you go to Syria and Iraq, they completely disagree with how that execution should be. So that's why they faltered. They weren't on any solid ground.
Right. And the Soviet Union did consider them useful because in context they were seen to be on the left of the Islamists, the monarchists, the traditional capitalists and whatnot.
Yeah.
But even then, the Islamists, the monarchists, the traditional capitalists, even the conservative Christian groups like the Phalange, they were also distinct from their own Western counterparts and didn't really fit neatly on the left-right political spectrum. And one more thing, I swear to God, Nasser in this photo looks like he's about to tell us a story while we're all having
I know,
dinner or
yeah.
something. Just the moment.
Yeah, definitely. We'll have to get into the Arab Cold War at some point. There was a Cold War that raged from like the 50s up until the early 80s, where it was these secular Arab leftists, even though they weren't full-on communists, trying to take down the monarchies in the Gulf and other areas. Like they thought that their brethren were disenfranchised or oppressed by the bourgeois. I mean, it sounded exactly like communism, but they just weren't quite as left as that. But yeah, like Nasser and many others said, oh, it's not just Yemen and Egypt that needs to be free, but even Saudi Arabia. So, well, Saudi Arabia was a very wealthy, functioning country. Why was it not free? So it was just massive ideological differences. But yeah, great questions, guys. I do have to head for now. Orthoholics, do you have any other follow-up questions, or was that it for now?
That was it for now.
Awesome.
Pretty much.
All right. Well, thank you guys for calling in.
Thank you, Jim.
I'm going to tune out for now. Please like the video, even though it's ending. Like it, and it's good for the algorithm. So, all right, guys. Thank you very much. I'm going to close out. So for everybody who has just came in and missed everything, this is what we covered today. So we covered all these topics. So not necessarily in order. We started with the war, how it's going. We went into the background of Ukraine and Russia, and then we ended up devolving into communism. And then at the very end, comparing Russian and Ukrainian communism to leftism in the Middle East. So thank you guys for listening. This one was when the callers came in, we definitely got a little more interesting. I don't know if you guys found this interesting. I would say this is not like my best stream ever. It was quite informative, but if you found it dry, my apologies. I will be doing a stream where I'm going to be reviewing some material live. So if you love when I do my reaction streams where Jake the Muslim metaphysician or Jay Dyer or this or that, I will be doing one of those. So prepare for that. That will be coming. I'm either going to do a response to the Voice of Reason conduct Mizrab, or I'm going to be doing one on the debate between Jake the Muslim metaphysician and this Christian professor. All right, so thank you guys very much. I'm going to sign out for now.
What's your business? Don't fake when I ride by. Ain't no drizzle, get truth off the east side. I know we ain't got my money because they ducking high. I grind for your mind. I got the